This is a tapestry portrait of King Arthur from about the time that Sir Gawain and the Green Knight would have been written in England. And you can see from the visage and the style that King Arthur was a very tough fellow, a hero. And in the 1300s, in the 14th century, which was a mystical century, the emphasis of genius of the 14th century is on mystical transcendent geniuses. And in that, King Arthur's toughness is a mystical toughness. It's an enduring toughness which actually translates into immortality. One of the most outstanding qualities of Arthur is his birth and death, which both occur within magic. His birth is a magical birth. His father, Uther Pendragon, is changed in form, magically changed into the form of the husband of Igraine, or Yugirna, as she is called in the most ancient manuscript, that of Geoffrey of Monmouth, about 1136. And Igraine, or Yugirna, is deceived by this magically transformed Uther Pendragon, and she receives him as her husband, and Arthur is born out of this magical, mystical union. And when he dies, he is taken away. He is taken off the battlefield. He's taken to the mystical Isle of Avalon, there to be treated and to be nursed, and he will come again. Arthur will not only return and reestablish his kingdom, but that being a magical, transcendent, mystical personage, death has no claim upon him in any permanent sense. The 13th century is illustriously characterized by some of the greatest mystical geniuses of all time. Meister Eckhart belongs to the 13th century. Mystics like Richard Rolle in England, who talk about the fire of language burning transcendently in their visionary capacity. The Fires of Love by Richard Rolle being one of the great classics of the 14th century. And along with a mystical transcendent century comes a need for its opposite, for its polar opposite. And just as the 14th century, the 1300s, are great for mystical things, they are also conspicuously there in the opposite, which is logic. So that one has this kind of polarity. Bertrand Russell wrote a very great book one time called Mysticism and Logic. The polarity of language, that a mystical language is polar opposite to a logical language. And in the 14th century, in the 1300s, mystical language was polarized to an exacting logical language. One of the greatest of all medieval logicians, William of Ockham, lived in this time period. And his great contributions to logic raised it from its scholastic beginnings into a most refined quality, so that the English language of the 14th century was great in a polarized bifurcation mode. It was great mystically, and it was great logically. So that the language that is known as Middle English, has both a great capacity for mythic imagery, which is the basis for a mystical outlook, and it's also capable of being excellent in logical discourse, which is, of course, aids symbolic objectivity. So the two languages, the symbolic language and the mythic language of the 14th century, make Middle English one of the world's great languages. One has to understand that English is not a primitive language at all, that Old English goes back to the 500s, to the 6th century. One has things like the Venerable Bede, the Ecclesiastical History of the English Nation, written in a very mature, beautiful, early English form. Beowulf, the great epic of Old English. So that Old English has this quality, a Germanic quality. Old English is very close to German. So that Beowulf, as an Old English epic, has this great capacity, this great balance to bring in what was the bifurcation at that time, the cultural polarity at that time. The polarity in Old English was between the Christian culture that was overlaying the ancient pagan heroic culture. So that Beowulf is an interweaving of the Christian ethos of charity, of love, of kindness, of commitment, of honesty, of dignity, of charitas. The weaving of the Christian ethos into the pagan heroic stories, the heroes, the tough guys. So too, later on in Middle English, one finds the interweaving, not so much this time of the Christian ethos, but what the Christian ethos had developed into after 700 years. Had developed into a mystical, transcendent quality of presence. And that mystical transcendence there, woven into the tremendous logical capacity of the language, so that one has mysticism and logic in Middle English woven together to produce, for instance, the precision of delineating human character that one finds in Chaucer. Chaucer is one of the world's greatest writers because he can draw in logical outline the definition of a human character, but he can color in that logical outline with the most delicate mystical nuances, so that one has in Middle English, in the example of Chaucer, a language which brings together in its time the mysticism and logic, the delineation by detail, and the gestalt by transcendence. So the Venerable Bede in Old English, Chaucer in Middle English. And when one looks to see how did English as a language develop, one finds that the next great step is Shakespeare. And Shakespeare's English, whose English we are just now beginning to transcend, just now beginning to go into some kind of fourth echelon of the English language. Shakespeare's language also weaves a polarity in, but the polarity woven into Shakespearean English is the polarity of a great person who is differentially capable to establish single-handedly, if need be, an objective cosmos. Shakespeare is the visionary, cosmic man who is able to establish a universe of his person, woven into a patterned gestalt of intractable nature, a nature which has instincts which cannot be modified, which has circumstances and conditionals which cannot be broached or circumvented. And so the clash between the great heroic transcendental personage, the cosmic man with his destiny, with his world which is intractable, with other persons, the rest of the cast, who are blind or who are malicious or who are ignorant or who are conniving, who are resistances to his manifestation, to his vision. And so English as a language has this tremendously long history. From the Venerable Bede to our day is about 1,300 years, 1,400 years. Now, 1,400 years takes in the whole distance of classical Greek. From Homer to Proclus is about 1,400 years. So that English as a language is remarkably as refined as ancient Greek was. It's as refined as Sanskrit was. It's one of the world's great languages of all time. We're concerned here today with the way in which Middle English, that language, brought mysticism and logic together and wove them together. And we're concerned not so much with Chaucer here, although in the second year of this course, if you get a chance, you can, as one of your year-long texts, you can choose the Canterbury Tales, and we'll talk about Chaucer next year at length. Chaucer, who spoke of himself as having written about a fair field full of folk, that the field of inquiry for Chaucer is the field of human beings, human character, and that human character, when looked at with a woven view of mysticism and logic together, one sees that the tremendous variety of human beings can be understood by gestalts of types. There are types of human beings that reoccur again and again. And were we to be able to understand a typology of human nature, then our whole engagement with the human realm becomes one capable of intelligent navigating. We have run across this type before. They will do such and so. And so Chaucer is one of the first developments on a very large scale of a typology applied to human nature, a typology which runs in the Canterbury Tales to about 28 different types. Compared to that, the four-part typology of Schiller or of Jung is very simplistic. But today, we're not talking about Chaucer so much. We're talking about one of the greatest geniuses of the world, an anonymous figure, who wrote Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is like the jewel of the 14th century. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is the most compressed, gem-like language form of the 1300s. It makes the 14th century weaving of mysticism and logic able to be brought into a singular focus. And the translations of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, its Middle English needs to be translated into modern English for the general reader. And J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, did the best translation into English. I like the one also by Brian Stone in the Penguin Classics. Just to give you a sample, here is Tolkien, and you'll recognize now that the language of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight becomes the style of language in Lord of the Rings. Here's a section where Gawain is beginning to face his doom in a landscape of bleak horror. And here's how Tolkien translates it, just a few lines to give you the flavor. Gringolet is the horse of Sir Gawain. Then he put spurs to Gringolet, and espying the track thrust in along a bank by a thicket's border, and rode down the rough brae right to the valley. And then he gazed all about, a grim place he thought it, and saw no sign of shelter on any side at all, only high hillsides sheer on either hand, and notched knuckled crags with gnarled boulders. The very skies by the peaks were scraped, as it seemed. Then he halted and held in his horse for the time, and changed off his front the chapel to find his visor. He's raising it and lowering it. Such on no side he saw as seemed to him strange, save a mound, as it might be near the marge of a green, a worn barrow on a brae by the brink of a water, beside falls and flood that was flowing down. The burn bubbled therein, as if boiling it were. He urged his horse then, and came up to the mound. There lightly alit and lashed to a tree his reins, with a rough branch rightly secured them. Then he went to the barrow, and about it he walked, debating in his mind what might the thing be. It had a hole at either end, at either side, and with grass and green patches was grown all over, and was all hollow within, naught but an old cavern, or a cleft in an old crag. He could not name it aright. And so you get this dramatic landscape tension, a mystical landscape, but with the inexorable logic of the quest narrowing down. Sir Gawain must find a chapel out in the wilderness, a chapel which is the private chapel of an occult king who is not like King Arthur, the king of a court, but he is the king of the wilderness. And so this mound, overgrown with wild grasses and some mysterious tunnel there, is the kind of chapel that the king of the wilderness would have. His religion is a religion of nature, wild and Paleolithic. And so the king of the wilderness, the Green Knight, is a knight king whose court is the wild Paleolithic realm. And Gawain is the representative of the courtly ethic of King Arthur's court, of a highly mannered court life dominated by courtesy, by knightly rules of chivalry. So Gawain comes from a very polished urban court, and his adversary is the polar opposite, is the lord of the wilderness, of the Paleolithic nature. Gawain is not a Neolithic cultured knight, but he's a symbolic cultured knight. And if he is a true knight of this symbolic culture of King Arthur's court, he will have woven the Paleolithic and Neolithic together into a perfect harmony. So that Gawain, if he is a true knight of the symbolic court, will be able to negotiate a Paleolithic challenge. Even though he himself is a stranger to it initially, he will be able to build a relationality with it and come through victorious. But what is difficult in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, because of the excellence of the author, the anonymous author, somewhere in the Midlands of England, this written at the same time as The Cloud of Unknowing, the great mystical Upanishad of Middle English of the 14th century. What makes Sir Gawain and the Green Knight so exotic is the imprecision of the venue, the indefiniteness of the context. One is never sure just how wide the context is, just how interlaced and interwoven the resonances are. And yet, the further that one goes into this increasing unknown tapestry, the more the curtailing of possibilities of action, the more that the etiquette of the court, the rules of conduct, the code of chivalry, narrows down increasingly the options that Sir Gawain has, until he must respond in one way and one way only. So that one has this tremendous energy of the true knight being narrowed down by the code of cultural symbolic values, so that he becomes a prow ever narrowing in an ocean ever widening with peril. And in this context, the author of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight conveys it by the kind of mythic language which he uses. Every line of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight has a triple alliteration. Every line in the entire poem. So that one gets a structural rhythm, very similar to the structural rhythm that Dante has in the Divine Comedy, where he uses terza rima, where instead of couplets, you will have 3 lines. But the constant use, the rhythm of Dante's terza rima, the constant rhythm of the anonymous author of Sir Gawain's triple alliteration, introduces a structure to the tapestry of the mythic unfolding. And the structure is one where language is so shaped, so honed, so faceted, as to be experienced in feeling tone as if one were entering into a jewel. That the world that is being presented in the book, that the realm that's being disclosed by the mythic telling of it, is a world which has a precision of a jewel already cut. And one enters into a blinding scintillation, a blinding brilliance that is not so much a mysticism of ambiguity, but is a mysticism of too much precision, of brilliance, of scintillating overkill, so that the facets tempt one to try to make sense out of the journey. What is happening? What is the precision here? So one is tempted constantly to use logic to figure out what is the trajectory that one is going through to predict what one must do. And at the same time, it is this very process that's encouraged by the language is also increasingly stymied by the possibilities. One has this relentless pull of 2 polar qualities. Increasing awareness that there is a precision operating, but the more that the precision operates, the more that the possibilities grow. And so one is caught. One is trapped. One is garroted by a fork of destiny that seems unsparing. And so Sir Gawain and the Green Knight has this character. Now the protagonist, Sir Gawain, Gawain himself, Gawain goes back in mythological types to a sun god. The very earliest appearances of Gawain are that he is very strong during the day, but he's kind of weak at night. He's strongest at noon when the sun is at its zenith. He's weakest at night at midnight. And so Sir Gawain has this kind of built-in logic, this biorhythm, as it were. And what happens in the development of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight as this myth is unfolded, is this diurnal quality is turned inside out. The challenges that come to Gawain come during the daytime rather than the night. The challenges of temptation are there in the morning and reach their apex around noon, a time when he is supposed to have his greatest strength. And they're the challenges of a beautiful woman trying to seduce him. in the daytime, in the morning, trying to culminate an infidelity at noon. And so this game of temptation is set as a challenge in the biorhythm of the Gawain mythos. But Sir Gawain is an Arthurian variant of the ancient Celtic Gawain. The Sir Gawain, as an Arthurian variant, has a superimposed structure which constrains his original Salar mythos. His Salar mythos is cut out, is stamped out by a superimposition of an Arthurian court ethic, of a chivalric code of behavior. And this chivalric code culminates in the development from the myth to the symbol. The mythic language interiorizes, and as it interiorizes, it generates more and more meaning. And the meaning, by pressure of its development, begins to coagulate structural elements out, and these structural elements become dominant. So as language interiorizes more and more, as the interior world opens more and more, a symbolic structure more and more takes over the content of the mythic language. The content of the mythic language is in the symbols, the field, the tapestry of imagery that becomes controlled by symbols. The mythic language has an image base, and in myth, pure and simple, the image base grows out of the ritual actions, whatever is done, the ritual comportment. So that mythic language starts with external action. But as mythic language matures, the internal symbolic structure begins to balance the external ritual action. So what one does is balanced more and more by what one thinks, until there's a point where what one thinks begins to overshadow what one does. Thought begins to overshadow action. And so the whole movement of myth, of the mythic horizon, is that it is like a membrane. It's a membrane surface that's permeable. And what passes through the membrane surface are the energies of nature. And as the energies of nature pass through this membrane surface, what one does is there objectively on the horizon of the ritual. It's like the surface of the earth. The cosmic universal powers of nature come at the surface of the earth into a focus of our activity, our bodies, other people's bodies. And so the very surface of the earth is the ritual theater, the ritual stage, the objective focus. But there is a penetration, because the powers of nature are not stopped by the ritual surface of the earth, but they go deeper, they go underground. They go under the earth, and they go within us. They go within bodies, within the bodies of the animals, within the bodies of the plants. And so the ritual surface is a permeable membrane that takes the energies of nature and filters it somewhat so that the internal energies are selected, refined, distilled qualities of natural energies. So that the inner energies, the mythic energies, are like elixirs. Mythic energies are elixirs of natural energies. It goes through this veil, this membrane, this sieve, this distillation process of our action, the pattern of our actions. And as mythic energies go deeper, go below the level where oral language would be spoken. For the spoken oral language always relates to the earth, always relates to the action, at least initially. But the ongoing penetration of natural energies not only passes through the ritual horizon of the objective world and through the surface of the bodies in this world, but as it goes inside the bodies, as it goes inside the earth, as it goes to an inner world or an underworld, the density of those energies changes into a structure which is symbolic. So one has this huge parfait. One starts with the universal energies of nature. One has the ritual comportment of the surface of things. One has the language depths underneath it. And then as language penetrates further and further, the lower depths, the further inner reaches of language become symbolic. So one goes from nature through ritual to myth to symbol. But mythology is one of the great mysterious processes. We call nature a mystery, a matrix of changes. What happens in myth is that this becomes selected out, distilled, becomes even more refined, so that language has this incredible capacity, the capacity to focus natural energies in such a way that there's a double process of distillation that happens. Let's take an image for a moment. If you look at an image, today in technological language, we would say that an image is composed of pixels, picture elements. And as you refine the number of pixels, so the image sharpens and becomes clearer. It's not only that one has more pixels per area to sharpen the image, but one can put more energy into any given pixel and also sharpen the image. So if you go along the lines of energy, one finds a sharper picture, or if you increase the dynamic pixels, one gets a finer and finer grain, and one clears the image that way. So images clarify in two distinct different ways. One is that there's more energy coming along, let's call it, let's use the neuronal net of the brain for a moment. More energy along the neuronal net will sharpen the image. More active cells enlarging the neuronal net will also sharpen the image. It can go either way. In mythology, in language, both of these processes tend to work together until there's an impediment, until there's a resistance. And when a resistance occurs, one or the other of these elements becomes curtailed, or being curtailed in compensation tries to overdo it. One finds that there is a tendency to try to have, if the pixels are curtailed in terms of numbers, one tries to overcompensate by seeing deeper into the pixels that one does have. This response produces a quality which we would say is delusion. The other is a quality which we would say is illusion, where one tries to make the intensity of each pixel, where that is impaired. So there's a quality here in mythic imagery where the image itself, which would occur in a natural way, begins to be compromised by the development of thought. that as thought begins to take some of the load-bearing weight, begins to play a larger compositional part, the imagery ceases more and more to be natural-based, and the mythic images become symbolic more and more. And there comes a point where the balance is left behind, and mythic images become more symbolic than natural. At this point, there is a need for some kind of compensatorial activity, and the possibility of illusion or delusion skyrockets. And in order to maintain a minimum of illusion, a minimum of delusion, the necessity is to keep the language ordered so that as it penetrates deeper and deeper into the symbolic realm, the mythic language, by being ordered, will not fray, but will penetrate all the way down to the bottom of the symbolic structural making capacity. Hence the concern of the author of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, with every line having triple alliteration, with the book having a structure that is almost airtight. It's like a superior program written in the 14th century that allows for this kind of language to penetrate all the way to the bottom of the symbolic use of mythic language. But at the same time, to keep its ability to refer back to nature, back to the original natural energies, unimpaired. So the whole purpose of a great myth like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is to establish, like a plumb bob, a scale of awareness that spans everything from nature to the bottom of the mind. So that this myth, the myth of the knight hero, is like trying to draw a diameter all the way through the entire realm of nature. From nature in its wild wilderness way, through nature transformed into ritual and ritual comportment, ritual actions, through myth, which is the development of language and its meaning possibilities, its feeling tone relationalities, into thought, into the depths of ideas, into the power of symbolic structures. So that Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is a very sophisticated myth. Its mythos, its plot line, goes all the way from the wilderness of the universe into the very center core of the human being, and keeps this diameter alive, or instead of a diameter, perhaps it's easier to imagine a radius coming from an unbounded surface into the very center. A plumb line, a mythic line that goes all the way. As it goes all the way, the crisis point is in the way in which language is used vis-a-vis image reference. Because only at a point of equilibrium will the image reference of a mythic language balance between natural energies, nature, and internal reference, ideas, symbols. There is a delicate point, or not a point so much, but as a phase, as an equilibrium in the process of myth, where language is perfectly poised to say something symbolic at the same time that it refers to something in nature. Something which one could discover is there in nature, in the process of how the universe works, but at the very same time is true of the deepest structure of the mind. So that mythic language has, in this spectrum of development, a critical phase, a critical point, a flash point, where if not handled correctly, There's a regression back into the nature reference now dominating mythic language in the form of ritual frozenness, of doctrinaire reduction. Or the peril on the other side is that language now, mythic language, becomes overly symbolic, overly structured, and becomes doctrinaire in that form, becomes an ideology. One can have a frozen ritual which would produce a fossilized culture, unable to change, and thus fragile, brittle. Because if conditions change, if the climate changes, if a new tribe moves into the area, these are challenges that were never woven into the culture originally. If you have a fossilized culture, these changes will destroy you. But the peril on the other side is to become infected with an ideology, to become a tribe of ideologues who are controlled by some kind of ideational complex, and again, unable to respond to nature, to themselves, to what we would call the real nature of challenge. The key to this is in the development of an equilibrium in mythic language. And because mythic language is always the index to feeling, the balance of the intelligence of feeling is the flashpoint in the development of reality as we deal with it. We'll come back to this after the break because there is a bifurcation in this challenge, in this flashpoint. One of them has to do with the masculine quality, and the other has to do with the feminine quality. Both are handled in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Let's take a break. We want to look at a polarity which is challenging. And the polarity is one that concerns all of us all the time. The polarity is the synthesizing symbol that holds us into our integrated form, and its polarity, which is the undefined, unknown universe. This polarity is a polarity between, to reduce it to a psychological jargon, it's a polarity between self and nature. The integral center of our self, the self, as Jung would say, the soul, as Christianity would say, that inner focus, that deepest center, is by the very design, structure, nature of things diametrically opposed to a universe which in its natural boundlessness has no center. So this polarity produces a condition of conflict on every conceivable level. The conflict has dimensions of tension, lines of tension that entangle themselves and produce all kinds of possible worlds. In what we're talking about today, the synthesizing symbol of the self is this 5-point star, the pentacle star, which is the symbol of Sir Gawain. You can pan the camera down and get this star symbol. The gold pentacle on a vermilion red background is the heraldic symbol of Sir Gawain. He has it on his shield, and it's on the horse gringole that he rides. And here's the description of the symbol. And opposed to this symbol is the wilderness of the universe, encapsulated in the Green Knight. So the story, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, the myth, the mythos, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, the very title of the myth is this polarity. Sir Gawain is defined by this symbol. That is to say, he is integrated, he is formally integrated along a symbolic culture so that he embodies this symbol. So our author, our myth teller, writes it this way. Then they showed him the shield with its shining gules, with the pentacle in pure gold depicted thereon. He brandished it by the baldric, and about his neck he slung it in a seemly way, and it suited him well. And I intend to tell you, though I tarry therefore, why the pentacle is proper to this prince of knights. It is a symbol which Solomon once conceived to betoken true faith, which it is entitled to, for it is a figure that has 5 points, and each line overlaps and is locked with another, and it is endless everywhere, and the English call it, as I have heard, the endless knot. Therefore it goes with Sir Gawain in his gleaming armor, forever faithful in 5 things, each in 5-fold manner. Gawain was reputed good and like gold well refined. He was devoid of all villainy, every virtue displaying in the field. Thus this pentacle knew he carried on coat and shield, as a man of troth most true, and knightly name annealed. Now in this presentation, there are 2 alchemical terms. One is annealed, that is to say, brought together so that they are impressed upon each other. The ancient way of portraying this was to take gold and silver and anneal them together and make electrum. So there was a time at the high pinnacle of the Bronze Age where metallurgy was really understood, where there was a quality where electrum was used as a metal, as an occult metal, as something hidden, as something that required real finesse and understanding to make. Gold and silver annealed together to make a white gold. When polished, has a burnish very similar to platinum. So annealed is an alchemical term. Also here is a term of refined, not just refined in terms of manner, but well refined like gold is refined out of its ore. And the process of refining gold of its ore is a process called cupellation. To refine gold out of its ore or out of any non-gold element, one takes a crucible made out of a kind of a gypsum and heats this to tremendous temperatures, and all of the minerals, all of the salts, all of the other metals will effervesce from this crucible or be absorbed, their gases be absorbed by this crucible, so that what is left after this tremendous refining heat process is a little button of gold at the bottom of the crucible. Everything else will have burnt away. So Sir Gawain is that knight who, after this tremendous cupellation of this myth, will still be remaining as the proof that he was a true knight, that he was the golden knight, he was the sun's knight. He was his golden pentacle self comes through and not only wins the day, but wins its place in reality. So that the universe will now welcome a new star. And this star will join the heavenly array of other stars, and the hero will become divine, a permanent part of the universe. So that this myth, this 14th century myth, this balance between mysticism and logic in Middle English language, is the great myth of the hero who establishes through going through a process which will burn away everything that is unnecessary, that is only partial, and leave only his true self. And the gold pentacle, the symbol of Gawain's self, will remain. Now the adversary in the myth, the bad guy in the myth, that adversary is an embodiment, is a mythic image of the wilderness of the universe. He's the wild man. In medieval manuscripts, one often found this long, shaggy-haired, troll-like man, usually with a club, and was the boogeyman of the wilderness, the fearsome Bigfoot of the forest, the Sasquatch of the Middle Ages, the Yeti of the unknown universe, the Paleolithic survivor of some uncanny embodiment of the primordiality of nature, come to challenge us. The alien from the wilderness of the universe, a predator who hunts specifically the would-be heroes. Those would-be heroes must prove themselves to him or die in the attempt. Only a real hero will survive this challenge from the wild man. But the medieval wild man, who is green because he is a part of the plant kingdom, who is wild because he's a part of the animal kingdom, who is eternal, he's a part of the mineral kingdom. He's the embodiment of nature. The first time that this mythic image comes through is not in the Middle Ages. It's not even in antiquity, in the classic mythology. It's in the most archaic levels of myth that one finds this image. And the first appearance in a written language of this figure is in the Gilgamesh epic of about 4,000 years ago. In the Gilgamesh epic, the wild man is named Enkidu. And here's the little section in the Gilgamesh epic, the coming of Enkidu, which tells us at the very basis why it was that there was such a thing as a wild man and why the wild man was always connected with women, with temptation, by very nature. Here's how it reads in the translation, Penguin translation, N.K. Saunders' Epic of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh went abroad in the world, but he met with none who could withstand his arms. In other words, Gilgamesh is an unbeatable warrior. No one can stand up to him. And because of this, Gilgamesh becomes arrogant, and he takes what he wants whenever he wants it all the time. His lust leaves no virgin to her lover, neither the warrior's daughter nor the wife of the noble. Yet this is supposed to be the shepherd of the city. He's supposed to be wise, comely, and resolute. The gods heard the lament of the people. The gods of heaven themselves cried out, "No one can challenge Gilgamesh. Let us cry out to the maker of people." So the goddess conceived an image in her mind. The goddess Aruru conceived an image in her mind, and it was the stuff of the firmament. She dipped her hands in water and pinched off clay and let it fall into the wilderness. And the noble Enkidu was created. And there was virtue in him of the god of war, of Ninurta himself. His body was rough. He had long hair like a woman's. It waved like the hair of Nisaba, the goddess of corn. His body was covered with matted hair like Samukhans, the god of cattle. He was innocent of mankind. He knew nothing of the cultivated land. Enkidu ate grass in the hills with a gazelle, jostled with wild beasts at the water holes. He had the joy of the water with the herds of wild game. So Enkidu is a kind of a Sumerian Tarzan. But there was a trapper who met him one day face to face at the drinking hole, for the wild game had entered his territory. On 3 days he met him face to face. So one has in the Epic of Gilgamesh the beginning of the 3-part challenge, the 3-day challenge, the 3-night sequence. On 3 days he met him face to face, and the trapper was frozen with fear. He went back to his house with the game that he had caught. He was dumb, benumbed with terror. His face altered like that of one who has made a long journey. With awe in his heart he spoke to his father. "There's a man like none other who's come down from the hills. He's the strongest in the world. He's like an immortal from heaven. He ranges over the hills with the wild beasts. He eats grass," hence the green quality. The greenness of the chlorophyll enters him, like Milarepa with pine needles and the rainwater turning green. Milarepa, at one point in the Tibetan legend, is the wild man of the wilderness. He's the Enkidu. He's the Green Knight. He ranges over the hills and eats grass, lives with the wild beasts. I dare not go near him. His father said, "Gilgamesh has never found a match, so we will match Gilgamesh with Enkidu. We will tell them of each other, and they will come face to face, and they will have a conflict." But in order to handle the wild man, to bring him into a situation with Gilgamesh, he has to be tamed. He has to be brought under control. So they bring to him a harlot, a child of pleasure, it says here in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The child of pleasure, the harlot, opens herself to the wild man who has never known woman. And after 6 days and 7 nights, Enkidu had forgotten his home in the hills. But when he went back to the wild beasts, his wild energy had been dissipated. And the wild beasts would no longer welcome him. He would no longer be at home in the wilderness. He had been tamed. He had been changed. He had been altered. He had been ritually selected out of wilderness, out of the wild openness, and now he'd become a man. So the Green Knight, in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, is the Middle English 14th century mythic image, the presentation of the embodiment of the wilderness, of the wild man. Opposed to Gawain, the power of the Green Knight is that he embodies the wild openness of nature, which includes life and death. Gilgamesh embodies, in his mythic image, the powers of life. But the Green Knight embodies not only the powers of life, but the powers of death also. And it's shown at the very beginning of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. I've assumed that you've read this, but apparently not all have. The story begins at Christmas time, not December 25th, but the medieval, the 14th century Christmas was always nearer to the new year. 12th night, 12 days after Christmas Day, January 6th, Epiphany, the descent of the light, in India called Diwali. In the ancient mythos, it was always 12 days after that one finds this descent, this birth, this renewal. And so at that new year, at that time, at that epiphany of light, at that beginning of the return of the sun, Sir Gawain is there with all the other knights of the Round Table, with King Arthur, with King Arthur's court. At the beginning of time, at the beginning of this year, at the beginning of all time, every year, forever, in King Arthur's archetypal court, there will come this situation where a challenge, this Green Knight comes into the court. And he challenges King Arthur. He challenges the entire court that they are lacking in the most essential quality of reality. They do not have the courage to face death. They have the courage of life, but they do not have the courage of death. And in order to demonstrate to them, a beheading ritual is enacted, a beheading game, a ritual in the format of a repeatable game. This losing one's head is an archaic motif. It appears in many places, not just in medieval epics and romances. Thomas Mann, in the 20th century, wrote a little novel called The Transposed Heads, which is all about this archetypal game. Heinrich Zimmer in The King and the Corpse, a book edited by Joseph Campbell for the Bollingen Foundation, has a section on Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and also a section about the loss of heads in this exchange of heads game. The game is very simple. You get to cut off my head, and next year at this time, you must come to my place where I cut off your head. The Green Knight issues this challenge. You may select your champion, King Arthur, to cut off my head here in your court, and next year, exactly at this time, that person who has cut off my head here will have to come to my court, and I will cut off his head there. This exchange of heads, this deep reciprocity, which is one of the structures of wilderness. We sometimes reduce it to the psychological term compensation. But it's a reciprocity. It's an exchange. But one of the fundamental qualities of reality is that exchange only happens perfectly in equilibrium. Only when there's an equilibrium does exchange happen effortlessly. One of the great mathematical examples of this is the exchangeable quality of zero and infinity. In any logical form, in any mathematical structure, zero and infinity can exchange with each other effortlessly and not change the forms or the expressions at all. All of the order, all of the form, all of the process capability of any structure will be untouched by the exchange of zero and infinity if done on that level of equanimity. So that in wilderness, in the Paleolithic universe, if there's an exchange with equanimity, there will be no damage, there will be no death, there will be no maiming. It will not be a crimping of form, as in a maiming. It will not be a termination of form, as in a death, but it will be an exchange. The reciprocity will be perfect and complete. And that's what the myth of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight demonstrates. That Sir Gawain is the knight who accepts the challenge to exchange his self for the self of the Green Knight. And the Green Knight's self is embodied in the mythic image that his head is detachable from his body. Sir Gawain strikes a blow, and the head rolls off and rolls down onto the court. And the Green Knight walks over and picks up his head and holds up his head, and the head speaks to King Arthur and his knights, saying, "Next year at this time, you will send Sir Gawain north, to the far north, and he will find my castle, and there is King of the Wilderness. In my court, I will behead him." And rides off. And exactly 1 year later, Gawain, with trepidation and fear, because he's had time to think of all this and what it means, he's a man. He's going to lose his head. He's going to lose his life. Does he not have confidence in his courtly manner? Does a courtly manner do you any good in this game? He must have confidence not in the efficacy of the symbolic culture with the courtly manner, but he must go down to the golden pentacle self. He must be able to stand reduced to that, because that alone can exchange. This golden pentacle self is like an infinity sign. It's his infinity. It's his individual, personal, soul infinity, which he's going to exchange with the zero of the Green Knight, with the negativity of the embodied, bestial, unknown wilderness. The zero of the alien will be exchangeable on an equanimity reciprocity with his golden pentacle deep self symbol. He will be able to pay for life again by exchanging his gold pentacle self with the zero oblivion of the wilderness of the universe embodied in the Green Knight. Only if he is able to allow himself to be reduced down to this and not give way. And so he carries a discipline with him. Here's how Tolkien, if you remember the beginning this morning, Tolkien translates the description. He gazed about, a grim place, he thought it, and saw no sign of shelter on any side at all, only high hillsides sheer on either hand. Notice how he's reduced down now to this valley of the shadow of death, this ravine that leads only one place. Not to a chapel which is recognizable in some kind of mankind religious sense, but a chapel which is a mound of death. It's a burial tomb. It is the tomb which is the chapel of the death side of the wilderness of the unknown of nature. And only the ancient transformation of the tomb into the womb will allow for life to come again. If one enters into the tunnel of the tomb and is not able to emerge on the other side through a rebirth, one will die there. This will be one's tomb. This will be the death mound. This is the cemetery for someone who is one-sided, someone who only can deal with life but cannot deal with death. Someone who deals with death in life terms will die there. But only someone who is whole, who can deal with life in life terms and deal in death with death terms, will be able to make the reciprocity, the exchange, will have the equilibrium, and will emerge again, will have lived life, will have died death, and thus will live again. And so Sir Gawain, who goes through this beheading contest, comes to the Green Knight's castle, does not recognize the Green Knight's castle, because wilderness is always undefined. One does not recognize it. There's nothing recognizable there. You cannot see it for what it is. And so it has a deceptive quality to it all the time. Not deceptive in that it's a lie, but deceptive insofar as it does not register as a recognition form. There is no cognition or perception of it. And thus the wilderness of the Paleolithic universe is always unknown and unknowable. Yet one enters into an interplay with it. And the interplay, as long as it's on the level of confrontation, is set up into a polarity whose ultimate poles are life and death. Forget hot and cold. Forget left and right. Forget good and evil. It's life and death. As a polarity, as a bifurcation, it's like a mutually exclusive pair that never touch each other. The most fundamental formulation of this ever on this planet was done by Parmenides, a pre-Socratic philosopher, in a mystical poem called The Way of Truth that was written when Socrates was a little boy. Parmenides, in The Way of Truth, says the most primordial, disjunctive polarity of all is that what is, and what isn't. And they never meet. The isness never touches the is-notness. And so life and nothingness is perhaps a better way to characterize the polarity. Not just life and death, but the extant and nothingness, being and nothingness. That this polarity is disjunctive and never meets, and thus there must be some way that one can jump from one to the other. One can make a leap from one to the other. And in understanding this, one develops the prowess of being able to, for a moment, for a split second, for an undetermined time, hold in suspension all of the recognizable coordinates of is, so that one can survive through the is-notness, that one can survive the blanking out of all referential coordinates whatsoever. The horror was expressed in the 14th century as the void. And self and void was the great way in which that polarity was understood. There was nothing more fearful, more terrific than voidness to medieval thought. What's peculiar is that in medieval logic, voidness was clearly understood as zero. So the infinity of the self was pitted against the voidness of zero. Now what's interesting is that the 14th century, the 1300s, is a great century in which there were great bridges made between East and West. The 1300s, the 14th century, was a time of Marco Polo going to China and coming back to Venice. He brought pasta from China to Italy. Can you imagine Italy without pasta? It was also a time when the development of contacts between India and Europe were being pioneered again. And so there are elements of China, elements of India, elements of Asia that are refreshed, that evoke ancient contacts in Europe at that time. And so there are, in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, these incredible resonances, so that one can understand Sir Gawain and the Green Knight in terms of an Asian correspondence as well as a classical correspondence, as well as an archaic correspondence. The Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh echoes with the Homeric qualities of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, echoes with the Indian yogic qualities, echoes with some Chinese qualities. What Chinese qualities were there? The whole figure of the knight errant is a Chinese development, not a Western development. The Chinese knight errant is developed long before there were any knights errant in the West. By the 300s AD, there were knights errant in China who had fantastic adventures. The knights errant in the West come about the 12th century, in the 1100s, the first time that one finds this kind of figure. It comes concomitantly with the development of myths about the Crusades. The whole development at this time, encapsulated perhaps most recognizably in the myth of Robin Hood. Well, King Richard the Lion-Hearted is away at the Crusades, back in the Holy Land, back in the Orient. His kingdom falls into the hands of his cousin. And the kingdom is compromised, and Robin Hood has to fight against single-handedly until Richard can return. That myth of Robin Hood in the 12th century is originally an Arthurian mythos. It's Arthur who goes to fight the Romans, who goes off to what from England is the East, goes off to fight the Romans. While he's gone, his nephew Mordred takes over the kingdom, takes over Queen Guinevere. In the very first appearance of King Arthur, Geoffrey of Monmouth, the only reference to the marriage of King Arthur and Guinevere is this simple statement: finally, when he had restored the whole country to its earlier dignity, he himself married a woman called Guinevere. She was descended from a noble Roman family and had been brought up in the household of Duke Cador. She was the most beautiful woman in the entire island. And that's it. That's all that's said about it. The next time one runs across Guinevere, is that Arthur spent the following winter in this locality near Rome. When summer came, he was ready to set out for the city of Rome itself, and was barely beginning to make his way through the mountains when the news was brought to him that his nephew Mordred, in whose care he had left Britain, had placed the crown on his own head. What is more, this treacherous tyrant was living adulterously out of wedlock with Queen Guinevere, who had broken the vows of her earlier marriage. So the Robin Hood stories about King Richard really have an Arthurian mythos at their deep structure. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is a focusing in the 14th century of this tremendous need for there to be some resolution at the deepest self, at the infinite deep self, that could hold, even when challenged by the void, the zero-ness of the Paleolithic wilderness of the universe. so that any challenge in between will have been met, no matter what it is. No matter how complex the world is, no matter how bad the problems are, no matter how intractable the situations, no matter how complicated the resistances are, they are all within a parenthetical field bounded by the relentless demonic excess of the zero void of the Paleolithic universe. That once someone can survive vis-a-vis that challenge, all the other intermediate challenges are doable, no matter what they are. But this one, the reciprocity of infinity of the self with the zero of the universe, so that one can live again, is the most primordial. It's the center line, it's the radius that goes through the entire sphere of the integral universe. No matter what happens in reality, if this radius is drawn, then the geometry of possibility is available for man forever. If there comes a time when this radius cannot be drawn, when no human representative can go to the center and make that fateful final exchange, then the forces of resistance, then the demonizing of the world proceeds to encroach upon man more and more. And the wilderness, instead of being a fruitful field of challenge, becomes then a threat, a demonic threat that increasingly delimits the possibilities of mobility for man. And men and women live in a cringing universe, codified as the early Massachusetts Bay Colony in North America. When the Massachusetts Bay Colony was just clinging like a ferocious bat to the Atlantic coast of North America, they viewed anything beyond 20 miles into the interior as fearful wilderness, as an oppressive, threatening unknown. And those wild human beings, those savages, the Indians who inhabited that wilderness, were ferocious demonic threats to them. The wilderness was a hell, and these were the demons of the hell. And exactly at that time, that mentality, that cultural pressure produced the witch trials of Salem. The accusation of the young girls of concourse with the devil through witchcraft comes concomitantly with this freezing, this tension, this pressurizing, this lack of courage, this cowardice of being able to be mobile in nature. And so it's a case in point that it happens all the time for every individual during their life that they must develop the courage to face the unknown. It happens at every stage of maturity in every culture that they must find a myth that will be able to express and develop this way through to draw that radius between infinity and zero. For the real will not be compromised. Without a sphere that has infinity and zero as its coordinates for its radii, the real will not obtain. And instead, there will be only the increasing delusional nightmare, the progressively illusionary threat. And the universe, instead of being a mother to us, as being an ocean of possibility to us, becomes a terminal adversary, intent upon murdering us, finally, and snuffing us out. This quality, this capacity in mythology, that it structures a story that must be told. A story that must not only be told, but the language of the telling must enter into the men and women who are able to hear it and to live it. A mythology is a script of life. It's like a DNA sequence that, if impaired, one will not have that form. The form of the courageous men and women who are able to be mobile in life requires for the sequence to be read out completely and full, not truncated. And it is the hero who reads out that sequence full and complete to perfection, who provides the proof in the cupellation of the challenges of life that there is still someone who can do it, someone who can cut it. That after facing the void and all of the attendant resistances and problems, they are still able not to survive, but to exchange themselves with the other. So it's the ultimate transcendence of the reciprocity of eternal exchange. If one is not willing to give up one's life, one cannot have life eternal. Can be said as simple as that. It is the secret exchange of selves that is the most guarded treasure of wisdom. In the Bodhicharyavatara of the 8th century, Shantideva talks about the courage of the Bodhisattva. The Bodhisattva is a kind of a Mahayana Buddhist knight-errant, developed long after Buddhism had come into China and the Chinese had influenced India. And one finds in Shantideva in the 8th century, about 200 years after Xuanzang goes from China, bringing the great Tang myths of the founding of the Tang dynasty, Tang Tai Tsung and so forth, bringing those to India, as well as taking the Buddhist manuscripts from India to China. Everyone talks about how Xuanzang took the Buddhist manuscripts from India to China. But what is usually left off, the realization that he also took the Chinese Tang dynasty mythology to India. And so you have the Indian Buddhist texts having a great revival in Tang China. And at the same time in India, you have the development for the very first time of a Buddhist Tantra, which has a tremendous development related to the development of Tang China and the development of a Taoist exchange, secret exchange of selves. Tantra is all about the secret exchange of selves. It's about the interflow. It's about the reciprocity of total complementarity. And when there's a reciprocity of total complementarity, one has at all times the real. And so with the secret exchange of selves in India and China of that age, one finds a resonance ever after that, wherever stories are told about the ultimate knight-errant, the knight who fights the dragon of the void. One finds ever after that all of these concomitant resonances that have accrued and joined to this great myth. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, one finds the beginning in written mythology of a basic theme and motif, but it undergoes accretions and permutations so that by the time of Sir Gawain the Green Knight, one finds that the challenge of seduction so that one is unable to have a complete exchange of selves, a seduction which is compromised by conditionals of the quest. Instead of it being Enkidu or the wild man, the Green Knight, who's in danger of losing this, it is his challenger, Sir Gawain, who's in danger of losing this. So a complete turning inside out. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is the Epic of Gilgamesh turned inside out. Why would it be that way? Because the Epic of Gilgamesh comes at the very beginnings of symbolic culture. The Sumerians, the very first time. This is the time of Sargon of Akkad, the Fertile Crescent, the joining of this great swath of cultures from Greece to India all together. Whereas Sir Gawain and the Green Knight comes at the very tail end of symbolic cultures, the 14th century. Because after the 14th century, after the 1300s, one finds a tremendous, because of the success of something like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, because of the success of some figures like Chaucer and Dante, one finds a transformation. Instead of a symbolic culture, one finds a new kind of civilization. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight belongs to the medieval culture at its high point, whereas what follows it belongs to the Renaissance. And the Renaissance is all about civilization, not about culture. The Renaissance is about the exploration of the differential realms of vision, of art, of history, of science, in addition to the integral ecology of myth, symbol, ritual, and nature. A civilization always includes the differential realm along with the integral cycle, whereas a culture always concerns itself with the integral cycle. It's problem enough for them. They have their hands full. And their hands are full to the extent of trying to find some myth that will link the reciprocity of infinity and zero in terms which they can feel, in meaning which they can think, and in actions which they can do. All this in view of a nature which to them is most certainly real. Next week, I'm going to bring Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and patterns of culture together and show you how this kind of implosive understanding yields symbolic mythologies. And you might look ahead, because the pair of texts for the symbolic mythologies are two figures who are just extraordinary beyond belief. One of them is Ernst Cassirer, and his little book in Dover paperback, still in print, called Language and Myth. And the other is Mircea Eliade, and his little book is called Myth and Reality. So language and myth, myth and reality. So myth is an arbiter between language and reality. Between a language which talks about natural happenings that has a resonance with symbolic reality. For one of the most shocking discoveries of all is that one's mind is a form which is objectified, and once objectified, it is nude before all the terrors and challenges of the universe. If one cringes at that moment, there's no end to where you have to cringe to. So the only real possibility, the only viable possibility, is to accept the challenge, not in terms of seeking victory at any cost or accepting defeat no matter how lowly, but with the naked strategy of making an exchange. In Kelly's Heroes, Don Rickles plays one of the characters, and he says to Clint Eastwood, who has been stymied by a German Panzer tank commander who will not vacate his position before the bank they want to rob, and Donald Sutherland, playing oddball, is listening in, all ears, and Don Rickles says, "We don't have to fight these guys. Cut a deal." Give them a percentage. And it ends up that oddball buys the tank. Enough.